My name is Noah Reed, I'm 29 years old, and I live in San Francisco, California, the same city where my grandmother built her empire and where, on one fog-drenched morning, my family tore itself apart. The first thing I remember about that day wasn't the sound of the church bells or the crowd of mourners. It was the silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. We were gathered at St. Mark's Cemetery, the fog crawling in from the bay, wrapping itself around the tombstones as if even the city wanted to hide from what was happening. My grandmother, Margaret Reed, was being lowered into the ground, and while everyone bowed their heads in mourning, my parents were already arguing. Their voices sliced through the calm like glass breaking. My father, Victor Reed, hissed that my mother had no right to touch his mother's estate. My mother, Clara, fired back that she deserved half because she had been the one taking care of Grandma in her final weeks. Their whispers turned into words, and those words became shouts. The priest hesitated mid-prayer. The mourners shifted uncomfortably. And then my father turned to me. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't care who heard. He looked straight into my eyes and said, "Noah, you're getting nothing. You don't deserve a cent of her estate." Before I could speak, my mother added sharply, "Your grandmother spoiled you, but she didn't raise a man worthy of the Reed name." The words hit harder than the cold wind off the bay. I clenched my fists, jaw tight, trying to keep my voice steady, because if I spoke, I knew it would crack. Before I tell you my complete story, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. I wanted to shout that I never cared about the money. That all I cared about was her. Grandma Margaret was the only one who ever made me feel like I mattered. She used to tell me, "You see the world differently, Noah. Don't let anyone dim that light." But now, she was gone, and I stood surrounded by people who measured love in dollars and power. The funeral ended, but the tension didn't. My father and mother didn't so much grieve as they calculated. Their minds were already on her $12 million estate, split between properties, investments, and lifelong savings. To them, death wasn't loss. It was opportunity. The reception that followed felt colder than the graveyard. Relatives whispered in corners. My Uncle Jonas leaned against a column, smirking as if watching a play. My cousins snuck glances at each other, curious about who would end up richer. I stood near the back, invisible as always. My parents stood front and center, sharp, composed, pretending grief while radiating greed. They had always been like that. My father, the lawyer obsessed with legacy. My mother, the socialite who wanted a son molded in her image, polished, ruthless, perfect. Instead, she got me, a man who loved books and sketching skylines instead of courtrooms. And she never let me forget it. "You waste time," she'd say. "You think art will feed you? It won't. And when your grandmother's money is gone, what will you have?" My father's criticisms cut deeper. "You're not strong enough to carry this family's name. You're weak." And yet, the only person who ever told me I wasn't broken was Grandma. When I failed, she reminded me that real strength wasn't loud, it was quiet. That kindness and integrity were worth more than any inheritance. Now, her absence left me hollow. Her warmth was gone, and all that was left was this, a public humiliation disguised as a funeral. When the service ended, my parents stayed near the casket, voices sharpening again. "You don't get to touch a penny of this estate," my father hissed. "Oh, please," my mother snapped. "I was the one who took care of her when you were too busy chasing clients." Their words echoed across the marble hall. The guests looked away awkwardly. Some whispered. Others smirked. Then my father's gaze snapped toward me again. His voice rose above the murmurs. "And as for you, Noah, don't think for a second you're entitled to anything. You've done nothing to earn it." My mother's lips curled. "He's right. You're just another disappointment." The laughter that followed from my uncle made my stomach twist. "Guess you'll have to learn to work for once, kid," he muttered. Every word stung, but I refused to let them see me crumble. I thought of Grandma's hands on mine as she taught me to paint. Of her voice whispering, "They'll never understand you. But one day, someone will." And as my parents' argument grew louder, I realized something. They weren't mourning her death. They were celebrating her wealth. And I wanted no part of it. Then, just as I turned to leave, a quiet voice stopped me. "Noah," someone said gently. I turned to see Robert Hale, my grandmother's attorney. A tall man with silver hair and a calmness that felt out of place among the chaos. "Your grandmother asked me to speak with you," he said softly. "There's something she wanted you to have." I froze. "Me?" He nodded once, his voice low. "Come with me, please." As we walked away from the noise, I felt the eyes of my parents and relatives on my back, suspicious, curious, judging. But for the first time that day, I didn't care. Robert led me down a narrow hallway, to a small room tucked away behind the reception hall. He closed the door quietly. On the desk in front of me lay an envelope, old, yellowed at the edges, sealed with wax. And across it, written in my grandmother's handwriting, was my name. The second I saw my name written in her careful cursive, my breath caught. The way she wrote, sharp yet graceful, was unmistakable. I hadn't seen her handwriting since the last birthday card she sent me, signed with, "My dear boy, never let them define you." Now, here it was again, her final message reaching across time. I took a hesitant step forward. The envelope was aged but elegant, sealed with the kind of precision that only she had. Robert's calm voice filled the quiet room. "She wanted me to give this to you personally," he said softly. "And she made it clear, no one else is to see what's inside." I looked at him, searching his face for any hint of what this was about. Did she tell you what it is?" He shook his head. "Only that you'd understand when you read it." The air felt heavier now. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing against the old paper. It was cool to the touch, fragile, but somehow weighty, like the moment itself. I broke the seal carefully, afraid of tearing something sacred. Inside was a folded letter and, to my surprise, a small brass key tied with a ribbon. The key glinted under the light, old but polished. The kind of key that belonged to a place, not a box, not a drawer, but a secret. I set it on the desk, my hands trembling slightly, and unfolded the letter. The first line made me stop breathing. "Noah, you are the only one who ever truly saw me, not my money. That's why I'm trusting you with what no one else knows." I stared at the words until they blurred. For a second, I couldn't move. Couldn't even blink. She saw me. All my life, I'd been invisible, dismissed, ridiculed, overlooked. But she'd seen something different. And now, even in death, she was proving it. My throat tightened as I read the next paragraph. "The key you hold belongs to a safety deposit box at Bayview Bank, just a few blocks from my old home. Inside is something not listed in my will, something I could not trust in the hands of your parents or anyone else. I built this family from the ground up, Noah, but I also built secrets to protect it. Those secrets are now yours." I looked up at Robert, my voice barely more than a whisper. "She mentioned, a bank?" He nodded slowly. "Bayview Bank. She instructed me to give you the key only after the service. Whatever's inside, it's between you and her." The room spun for a moment as the reality of it sank in. My grandmother, the woman my parents accused of spoiling me, had left me something hidden. Something private. Something off the record. And from the way she wrote, it wasn't money. It was bigger. I turned the key in my hand, its brass surface cool and heavy. My mind filled with questions I couldn't voice. What could she have hidden? Why me? Robert's voice broke my thoughts. "She trusted you, Noah. She said you'd know what to do when the time came." I exhaled shakily, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "She really said that?" He nodded, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Confidence. I folded the letter back carefully, tucking it into my jacket. The key I slipped into my palm, holding it tight like a promise. "Thank you, Robert," I said. "Don't thank me," he replied gently. "Just honor her faith in you." When I stepped out of that small room, the noise of the reception hall hit me again, laughter, whispers, glasses clinking. My parents were back to performing grief for the guests, their smiles polished, their words hollow. They didn't even notice me pass by. And that was fine. For once, I preferred it that way. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel the key pressing against my hand through my jacket pocket, small but powerful, like a spark in the dark. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the letter's words repeating in my head. "You are the only one who ever truly saw me." Those words hit deeper than any inheritance ever could. By morning, I knew I couldn't wait. The fog outside had lifted slightly, revealing the skyline through streaks of gold sunlight. The streets of San Francisco glistened from the previous night's rain. I threw on a jacket, pocketed the envelope, and stepped out into the cold. Bayview Bank wasn't far, an old stone building near the marina, with brass doors and a clock tower that seemed frozen in time. It was the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing, but now it felt like the center of the world. When I entered, the faint smell of paper and polished wood filled the air. A man in a navy vest greeted me from behind the counter. "Good morning. How may I help you?" My voice shook slightly. "I need access to a safety deposit box registered under Margaret Reed." He checked my ID, then glanced at the authorization letter she'd left on file. After a pause, he nodded. "Right this way, Mr. Reed." We walked down a long hallway, our footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The vault door ahead was enormous, thick, circular, covered in steel bolts that looked like they belonged to another century. With a series of metallic clicks, the guard opened it and led me inside. Rows upon rows of small silver boxes lined the walls, each holding its own secret life. He pointed to one. "Box 473. You can use the private room to view the contents. I nodded, sliding the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for me. The box slid out with a soft scrape. I carried it to the small viewing room, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I set it down on the table. The metal was cold against my palms. For a moment, I hesitated. I thought of her, her laugh, her wisdom, her strength. Then I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of small leather-bound journals tied with a faded ribbon, a velvet pouch, and a sealed envelope addressed in her handwriting again. To Noah, when you are ready. It wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the quiet hum of the vault echoing in my ears. The fluorescent light above flickered softly, casting reflections on the polished metal box. I could almost feel her presence in that room, calm, patient, like she'd been waiting for me to open this for years. My hands trembled as I untied the faded ribbon around the stack of journals. The leather was worn and smooth, the pages yellowed and soft at the edges. When I opened the first one, her handwriting filled the pages like a living voice. If you're reading this, Noah, it means I'm gone, but I finally get to tell you the truth without fear. I blinked hard, forcing myself to keep reading. You always thought your parents were successful because of hard work. But they built their comfort on my sacrifices, and my silence. Each sentence was a punch to the gut. She wrote about her youth, how she had grown up poor in Sacramento, the daughter of a maid, working her way through nights and building her wealth one careful step at a time. Every business she built, every investment she made, was done with precision and discipline. And yet, she wrote, when her fortune began to grow, her children, my parents, changed. Victor began to see me not as his mother, but as an obstacle. He wanted control. Clara wanted status. I thought if I helped them, they'd find peace. I was wrong. They became greedy, and greed is the one disease money can't cure. I kept turning the pages, my heartbeat quickening. Her words weren't bitter, they were sorrowful, reflective, filled with a strange compassion even for those who betrayed her. I kept my silence to protect the family name. I let them think they were in control. But every lie has a limit, and I decided long ago that you would be the one to know the truth. By the time I reached the end of that journal, my hands were shaking. For years, my parents had told me I was the family's disappointment, weak, naive, unworthy. But here it was, in my grandmother's own words, the truth was never that I wasn't enough, it was that they were afraid of what I might become. The second journal was older, filled with decades of stories, her marriage, her struggles, her rise from poverty to prominence. She had detailed every deal, every betrayal, every act of kindness that built the Reed name. And then, in one entry, my breath caught. Jonas forged my signature on documents. Clara diverted funds for her personal investments. Victor used my accounts for leverage in his failing law firm. I pretended not to know. I let them believe I was blind. But I was always watching. I sat back in my chair, my mind spinning. All my life, I'd seen them as powerful, flawless, untouchable. But she had seen through them all, and documented it. These weren't just diaries. They were evidence. My eyes drifted to the velvet pouch lying beside the journals. I loosened the drawstring and tipped it gently over the table. A cascade of jewelry spilled out, pearls, a diamond brooch, a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials MR. Each piece shimmered under the light, old and priceless. But beneath them, folded carefully, was a small certificate. A property deed. The document read, Reed Cottage, Mendocino Coast, California. It was a small oceanfront home I'd never heard of. And the owner's name, Margaret Reed, was crossed out in ink. Beneath it, she had written, to Noah Reed, upon my passing. My hand covered my mouth. She hadn't just left me a token of love. She had left me a sanctuary. The cottage wasn't part of the estate. That meant my parents didn't know it existed. I reached for the last envelope, the one that had been resting beneath the pouch, and tore it open carefully. Her words were shorter this time, but heavier. Noah, I gave your parents everything they thought they wanted. Money. Status. Power. But I kept what mattered most hidden. The truth. These journals contain my story, and the record of every betrayal I've endured. You are the only one I could trust to decide what happens next. The jewelry and the cottage are yours. But the greater inheritance is wisdom and responsibility. Use it to build a life that honors honesty, kindness, and courage. Remember, wealth without integrity is poverty of the soul. By the time I reached the final line, tears blurred my vision. She hadn't just left me possessions. She'd left me purpose. For the first time, I realized why she'd always defended me. She saw the part of me that mirrored her, the quiet resilience, the refusal to become like them. I closed the letter, sat back, and pressed my palms against my eyes. I had come to the funeral expecting humiliation. I left that bank with something far greater, a legacy built on truth. As I packed the items carefully back into the box, a wave of fear mixed with determination surged through me. If my parents discovered what I now held, the journals, the proof, the property, they'd stop at nothing to take it. But then I heard her voice in my head again, calm and firm. "You're the only one who ever saw me, Noah." I understood now. She hadn't chosen me because I was perfect. She chose me because I was different. Because I still believed in decency when everyone else around her had forgotten it. I slid the journals into my backpack, wrapped the jewelry in the velvet pouch, and tucked the letter into my inner pocket. As I left the vault, the air outside felt lighter. The city was still gray, the fog still clinging to the streets, but I wasn't the same man who had walked in. For the first time in my life, I carried more than shame or rejection. I carried truth. And I was determined to protect it. The moment I stepped outside Bayview Bank, the fog had thickened again, curling through the streets like smoke, wrapping the city in a kind of ghostly silence. I pulled my jacket tight against the chill, the weight of my backpack pressing against my shoulders. Inside it were the journals, the jewelry, the letter, everything my grandmother had trusted me with. It felt like I was carrying her voice. Her truth. Her final breath. For a long time, I just stood there on the steps, watching cable cars rattle past and people hurry by, unaware that a storm was brewing in my chest. To the world, this was just another quiet San Francisco morning. To me, it was the beginning of everything changing. I walked home slowly, the brass key still in my pocket, its edges cool against my fingers. Every step replayed her words in my mind. "You are the only one who ever truly saw me. Use it to build a life that honors honesty, kindness, and courage." When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and spread everything out across the kitchen table. The journals. The property deed. The jewelry. The letter. For a while, I just looked at them, the symbols of her life, her legacy, her faith in me. Each one carried a piece of her story. But alongside the pride I felt, a cold unease crept in. What if my parents found out? What if they went through the lawyer? What if they challenged the legality of her gifts? I could already imagine their fury, my father's voice dripping with venom, my mother's disbelief turning to rage. "You think she'd leave something important to you? You've done nothing to earn it." I gripped the edge of the table, my heart pounding. For years, those voices had defined me. But not anymore. She had left me more than secrets, she had left me a choice. To stay silent, or to rise. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the city lights flickering below, my mind racing. I reread her words until I could recite them from memory. She didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. She wanted someone to carry forward the parts of her that greed hadn't destroyed. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. The first thing was to see the cottage, the one she'd left on the Mendocino coast. A place untouched by their influence. A place that was hers, and now mine. 2 days later, I packed a small bag, tucked the journal safely inside, and drove north along Highway 1. The Pacific stretched endlessly beside me, gray and wild. The further I got from the city, the lighter I felt, like I was peeling off years of pain 1 mile at a time. When I finally reached it, my breath caught. The cottage sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, its white shutters worn from salt and wind. The front steps creaked under my weight, and when I pushed open the door, the faint scent of lavender and wood polish filled the air. It was like stepping back in time. Framed photos lined the hallway, black and white memories of her youth, her smile frozen in moments of joy and strength. On the mantel sat a picture of her holding me as a child, both of us laughing. I hadn't seen that photo in years. My parents must have hidden it away after one of their fights with her. The sight made my throat tighten. She had thought of everything. This place wasn't just an inheritance. It was a sanctuary, a part of her she'd preserved for me to find when I needed it most. I explored the house slowly. Every corner told a story. A half-finished quilt lay draped over a chair. Books lined the shelves, filled with handwritten notes in the margins. The kitchen counter still had her old tea kettle resting on it. I boiled water, poured a cup, and sat by the window overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed below, the horizon glowing faintly under the late afternoon light. And for the first time since the funeral, I let myself cry. Not from sadness, but from relief. For so long, I had carried the belief that I was a failure, that my family's scorn was justified. But now, holding her letter and seeing what she'd left me, I understood something simple and profound. My worth had never depended on their approval. That night, as the wind howled outside, I opened one of the journals again. Her words flowed through me like a conversation across generations. She wrote about forgiveness, how it doesn't mean letting people back into your life, but freeing yourself from their power. She wrote about resilience, how she had built her empire brick by brick, even when the world told her she couldn't. And she wrote about me. Noah is different. He doesn't chase power, he searches for meaning. That's why I trust him. I read that line over and over until the ink blurred through my tears. She had seen me for who I was, not the man my parents tried to shape, but the man I was meant to become. As the days passed, I started fixing small things around the cottage, mending a loose shutter, oiling the old hinges, scrubbing the faded tiles in the kitchen. It felt therapeutic, almost sacred, like every nail I hammered was a promise to her. I even painted one wall in her favorite color, soft blue, like the sky she used to paint in her garden portraits. Each night, I fell asleep to the sound of waves and wind, the noise of the world replaced by peace. And then, one evening as the sun dipped low, I walked out to the cliff's edge and whispered into the wind. "I'll honor your trust, Grandma. I promise." The wind carried the words out to sea, and I swear I could almost hear her voice in the rush of waves. The days at the cottage passed quietly, like pages turning in a book I didn't want to end. Each morning, the Pacific roared against the cliffs, and each evening, the sun disappeared into the horizon, orange melting into silver. It was there, in that peaceful rhythm, that I began to understand my grandmother's final lesson. She hadn't left me money to spend. She'd left me meaning to live by. I started spending my mornings reading through the rest of her journals. Some days, I'd laugh softly at her wit, her little notes about how she fooled my father during business deals. Other days, I'd sit in stunned silence as I uncovered more of the truth she'd hidden beneath her grace. She had known her children better than anyone, their greed, their ambitions, their flaws. But she had loved them anyway. Not blindly, but with the hope that someday they'd find their way back. I realized then that all of this, wasn't about punishing them. It was about breaking the cycle. For so many years, the Reed family name had been about control, reputation, power. But here, in the stillness of the cottage, I found something far greater: freedom. I wasn't chained to their expectations anymore. I wasn't the disappointment, or the quiet embarrassment, or the invisible son. I was Noah Reed, the man my grandmother believed in. One afternoon, I sat on the porch overlooking the water, her last letter in my hands. The paper had softened from how many times I'd read it, the ink slightly smudged from my thumb. "Do not waste what I've given you fighting for what others desire," she'd written. "The greatest inheritance is peace, the kind you earn by living honestly." Those words echoed in me like a heartbeat. I could have used those journals to destroy my parents. I could have exposed their manipulation, revealed their theft, humiliated them the way they'd humiliated me. But every time I thought about doing it, I heard her voice again, steady, kind, resolute. "Do not become them." So I made my choice. I wouldn't use her secrets as weapons. I'd use them as a compass. Over the following weeks, I began to plan quietly. I sold a few of her vintage pieces, not for luxury, but to fund something I knew would make her proud. I opened a small foundation under her name, the Margaret Reed Trust, designed to provide scholarships for underprivileged students in San Francisco who wanted to study art, literature, or social work, paths my parents once called a waste of time. It was poetic in a way. The fortune they fought for would now go toward helping the very kind of people they looked down on. I remember standing outside the notary's office after signing the final papers, watching the fog roll in. The air was cold, but I felt lighter than I had in years. I went back to the cottage that evening, lit the fireplace, and sat surrounded by the sound of crackling wood and crashing waves. On the table beside me were the journals, all of them, now bound with a new ribbon. I planned to keep them safe, not locked away, but preserved for the future, proof that legacies built on truth last longer than those built on greed. As I sat there, I realized something. For the first time, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. Not my father's. Not my mother's. Not even the world's. I was simply enough. The next morning, I visited her grave back in San Francisco. The cemetery was quiet, the same place where months earlier, my parents' voices had poisoned the air. But now, the silence was peaceful. I knelt by her tombstone, brushing away a few fallen leaves. "You were right," I whispered. "They'll destroy each other fighting for what never mattered. But I won't let your story end that way." I pulled a small envelope from my pocket, inside it, a photo of the ocean cottage and a single pressed daisy from her garden. I placed it against the stone. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed," I said softly. "And I'll spend the rest of my life earning it." As I stood to leave, I noticed something small and strange, a glint of brass near the base of the headstone. I bent down and found her old locket, half buried in the dirt. Inside was a picture, her on one side, and me as a child on the other. I smiled through tears. Even after death, she still found ways to remind me I wasn't alone. When I walked away from her grave, I didn't look back. Not out of disrespect, but because I knew she'd never really left. She was in every word she'd written, every wave crashing against the shore, every quiet decision I made from that moment forward. Weeks later, I sat in my office overlooking the city, a modest space I had rented to run the foundation. On the wall behind my desk hung a framed quote from her journal. "Integrity isn't inherited. It's chosen." Below it, I'd placed a small photo of the two of us. Every morning, before I began work, I looked at it and whispered the same words. "I'm choosing it, Grandma." Every day. And every night, when I returned to the cottage, I'd light a candle, open one of her journals, and read a few pages. It became my ritual, a quiet promise that her story, her truth, her legacy would live on through me. The city still buzzed with greed and ambition. My parents still fought over their share of her estate, their lives consumed by the very poison she had tried to cure. But I no longer cared. Their empire was built on illusion. Mine, the one she left me, was built on truth. And in that truth, I finally found peace. Would you have done the same in my place? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories where greed meets justice, and love outlasts everything else.